coming Monday, if you haven't seen it on the website, we're having a standalone talk on the sinking of the Lusitania, and a fascinating piece of history in that there were so many multiplicity of lenses with which the event was viewed. The German perspective, the American perspective, the British perspective all saw this a little bit differently, which is a fascinating exercise in historical inquiry. So if you're a student of history, I would encourage you to tune in for that one too. Little shameless self-promotion. Anywho, let's get started on tonight's lecture, which is Watery Highways. And let me see if I can get this queued up. All right. Okay, let me minimize this. I think yep. Slideshow from beginning. All right. Okay. Here we go. Watery highways. So we're going to talk a little bit about the geologic retreat of the glacial middens that sort of formed this area, this region, this very rich and illustrious region. Basically, the short math, without going into an extensive dissertation on geology, which I know nothing about, the end of the Pleistocene era, the Great Ice Age, the Chesapeake area merged, rising maybe 1,000 feet above sea level. And basically, these streams, these tributaries, were created by melting ice, carved a series of valleys in the coastal plain. We'll get to that in a little bit, the two basic divisions of topography, the coastal plain and the Piedmont Plain. Anyway, they carved a series of valleys in the coastal plain, eroding away softer deposits of soils and organic matter, leaving the more resistant clayish areas standing as watersheds between valleys. So the prehistoric Susquehanna River Valley basically excavated the valley now occupied by the Chesapeake Bay. You can see on this picture on the right, there's the Susquehanna running up and down, north and south. That would actually widen out and become the Chesapeake Bay, okay? And into this Susquehanna River flowed freshwater streams that joined what would be the James, York, Rappahannock, and Potomac rivers. And then discharged at the foot of the Susquehanna River was discharged in the Atlantic Ocean. And basically what was going to happen, the coastal plain would subside a little bit, the erosion would occur and leave us with, after hundreds of years, kind of the current configuration of the Chesapeake Bay. And this is a wonderful, I love this sort of isometric illustration of the various soils and the plate tectonics of the region. You have the on the left, the Appalachian Plateaus, the valley and ridges forming the Blue Ridge Mountain peak here, the Piedmont Plain, the fall line, which we'll get to in a bit, why that's so important, and then the coastal plain from which the Chesapeake Bay was formed from, sort of eroded, and again, the soils sort of settled. Yeah, you can see down here sort of a summation. The region began to sink. The principal valley of its lower course became so low that the sea flooded its mouth. So that little skinny discharge from the Susquehanna River widened out as the soils subsided a little bit and widened out the mouth of the Chesapeake Bay, okay? And the Chesapeake Bay in its present shape assumed that about 3,000 years ago. So in geologic time, pretty young, all right? So here's your basic physiographic provinces of Maryland and Delaware. So the yellow is the coastal plain, as we just discussed. The beige is the Piedmont Plain. The line of demarcation between the yellow and the beige is the fall line. Okay, you're going to hear this a lot, talk about this, because it is very important. And we'll get to that a little bit. And I just went over these basic areas, the Appalachian Plateau, the Valley and Ridge, and the Blue Ridge to the west, all right? So the Piedmont Plains range, between 400 and 1,200 feet high. They're much harder, denser than the Atlantic tidal plains, made up of different types of soils and minerals, characterized by gently rolling hills, and they comprise about 25% of Maryland's total area. Western border being the Blue Ridge Mountains, eastern border being that fall line again. You're just going to be sick of me talking about this fall line after a while. And you can see it running all the way from New Jersey down through Maryland into Virginia and into North Carolina, okay? That fall line. Those are basically the joining of the coastal regions to the Piedmont regions, all right? So there it is again. Sick of it yet? So basically, to expound on this a little bit, the coastal plains, these tributaries that were formed, these various rivers, this was as far, water is self-leveling. This is as far as seawater could travel. And then it hits this Piedmont Plain, which rises up and basically fresh water falls down into these tributaries, and they're often characterized by waterfalls, hence the term fall line, right? And these would become eventual sites of very prominent cities, warehouses, and large towns. Also, what can you do with a waterfall? Well, you can use it for grist mills. You can use it for all manner of light industry, basically, back in the day. Water power was, the cornerstone of many of these types of endeavors. So the towns along the fall line would basically be grow around these various mills, started off very small, and then would move to other things, move into the late 19th, early 20th century electric power and whatnot, hydroelectric types of things, okay? All right. So a little bit about describing the bay. Noblest bay in the universe, I believe John Smith said that. Runs north and south, extending these are the long and lat of the bay, roughly 200 miles long by 22 miles at its widest point. Deepest part, 156 feet to about 19 feet at its shallowest at the head of the bay. Has about 48 principal tributaries and a total shoreline of 4,612 miles. So, I mean, look at this. You've got a tremendous amount of waterfront real estate in and around the bay, which, of course, remember we talked about tobacco last week. Well, this is what gave rise to all of those wonderful tobacco plantations, because you could have wonderful plantations, very good earners along all these rivers, and feeding into the bay made transporting the cargoes, as we mentioned, very efficient and swift, because water transport was the way to go, okay, at this point anyway. So tremendous amount, and you can already see the amount of infrastructure that would grow over these waterways and these tributaries, okay? Down here at the foot, just the two capes, Cape Charles, Cape Henry, Newport News, Hampton Roads down at the base, okay, and Baltimore up at the head, all right? So the Bay Area's first inhabitants, not surprisingly, the Piscataway Indians, have been in the region for 7,000 years. It's the dominant tribe in the north of the Potomac, which is what is now Charles County. You can see on this sort of breakdown on the left, it's a sort of distribution of the different tribes, okay, the Nanticoke, Piscataway, Yacomico, et cetera. So the different tribes were in and around this area, and really they practiced what could be termed unparalleled land and water stewardship for their pre-contact period. I mean, they really lived, it sounds a little cliche, but they really lived in a harmonious fashion with the environment, really. I mean, we haven't been able to match that to this day. Below, you have John Smith's map of about 1608, where he's, John, we'll get to him in a little bit, made that exploratory voyage up the bay and mapped much of it. So back to the Piscataway, agrarian-based economy. They grew corn, several varieties of beans, melons, pumpkins, and squash, and ceremonial tobacco. As we learned last week, some of the first exposure that Europeans had to tobacco was through native people contact. The Yacomico owned land upon which St. Mary's City would eventually be built, so that's important to sort of file away when the Ark and the Dove come over. And the Piscataways were Algonquin in origin, so that's up north. So they must have migrated down south. Originally hunter-gatherers, so fish, game, wild plants, growing corn around 800 AD to supplement their diet. Corn was to become a staple, and native, or rather Europeans, were they not exposed to this type of diet, they probably would have starved, because they really weren't familiar with the land and the soils and what would grow there and what wouldn't. Okay, other crops were added over time, and they lived in permanent villages based on climate and proximity to water. Now, unlike their relatives, the Algonquin, they basically had winter and summer camps. So winter camps being inland, summer camps being coastal, and they would transit between the two camps, but these were fixed positions, and this is a very anglicized engraving of one of the Piscataway camps. It has a palisade running the perimeter, much like a fort, much like the Europeans did, and these witu, or small huts, which were actually, in terms of heating and cooling, they're very energy efficient, which unlike the European structures, they sort of a very, the, the domed, or rather the arched roof, sort of convected that heat back down and around. It was a very efficient structure to heat in the wintertime. And this is a print from the Library of Congress, circa 1671. Okay, so it's just interesting to see how Europeans tried to anglicize the sort of native peoples in these very symmetrical, European-inspired type encampments, when perhaps they were a little bit more organic, a little bit less rectilinear in composition, these structures and whatnot. But that was their experience. That was the lens with which they viewed who they saw and who they met. Okay. So we talked about this in the boat building lecture a little bit. This is Captain John Smith describing their log canoes, making one tree in the form of a trough. It's a little refresher for you guys that have seen the other lectures. Some of them are L deep, 40 or 50 in length. Most are smaller, very 10 and 12 with some luggage over the broadest rivers. Instead of oars, they use paddles and sticks, which they row faster than we in our barge. Yeah, I mean, a canoe is a much swifter boat than a pinnace or a shallop or any of the European types of vessels, which required oar and sail and were heavy and beamy boats. So dugout canoes are much more energy efficient, I guess, the amount of people it took to paddle them. Of course, they couldn't carry as much as a shallop, but then again, I don't think they really needed to. They weren't really thinking along those lines. So the Spanish were the first to actually discover the bay. I mean, aside from native peoples, of course. In the 16th century, they named it Baja de Santa Maria. At the right is the map in 1562 by Diego Gutierrez. They mapped North American coastline, north of Florida up through New Greenland by 1501. So right after Columbus, they were headed up the coast to map the coastline. Ponce de Leon made the first major effort to establish a permanent settlement in North America in 1521. So I love, and there it is, the red arrow showing the Baja de Santa Maria, the Chesapeake Bay. And you love how they, look at the iconography to the right. You have a shipwreck, you have a sea monster, basically discouraging other people from, other explorers, other countries from exploring this region, because they're, again, you have to view maps of this time as basically tools of empire. They were. The maps were completely distorted to basically favor those people that drew them, okay? The maps were symbols of dominion, of power. If we map it, it's ours. This was often, I mean, the Spanish were notorious for making landfall somewhere, planting a cruciform of some sort and claiming it for their own, and then leaving. We planted a cross, we made a map, so it's ours, type of thing. So anyway, it's just very interesting. I love studying old maps, because especially the European, the English were to start populating their maps with all the commodities. And again, I think we talked about this several lectures ago, this idea that land of milk and honey, this was a wonderful place to come. It was enticing people to colonize, to come across the pond and colonize there by showing all of these commodities on these maps, okay? Okay, so 1633, we have the Ark and the Dove. Ark and Dove set sail from Maryland, 1633. Ark returned to England, and Dove stayed as a coastal trader. They separated on the voyage. They didn't really know if Dove made it. The Ark didn't. They found each other on the other side. King Charles I granted land south of the 40th parallel to the Potomac River to George Calvert, Lord Baltimore. And the first Maryland colony was named after Queen Henry Maria, wife of Charles I, so St. Mary's. You can see Cecil Calvert, second Lord, organized the expedition of colonists. His brother Leonard Calvert served as the first governor of Maryland. And here you have a illustration. It's one on the lower pane here, and the Dove is on the left, the Ark is on the right. This is actually the configuration that the current replica of the Dove, the new Maryland Dove, is in. It's not a ship-rigged as the one on the upper left. That's the current Maryland Dove. But the new one is catch-rigged and has a large spritzel main coming off that foremast there. So it's very exciting. That'll be over in St. Mary's in about a year. Very excited to see that vessel. All right. So St. Mary's City, as I mentioned, the land upon which it was built was obtained from the Yacomico native peoples in 1634. Initially, the Europeans and Yakamako lived together peacefully, which is more than I can say for some peoples up north. They're influenced by both the Powhatans and the Piscataways. Awerowance was the leader of the tribe, and they shared cultural traditions of local and Wampanoag tribes. Again, the Wampanoags are from up north, Massachusetts, and north of there. So there were some shared traditions among these people. You can see in this. I love these paintings. They show everybody having a good time. There's a priest sort of blessing the whole thing. You have Europeans and native peoples all singing and dancing. There are the ships in the harbor showing you who's in control. But the native people are just having a grand time hanging out with the English. So were it only so. So anyway, so we mentioned John Smith. Yeah, much of what we know about the bay, and at this time anyway, came from John Smith's 2 exploratory voyages up the bay in 1608. His instructions were simple: map the area, claim land, of course, find gold. This should sound very familiar. Find gold and other riches, right? Trade with the natives and find passage to the Pacific Ocean, that great Northwest Passage, right? So this is the same instructions that every colonist got who got a charter from the Crown or from a merchant stock coalition over in England. Find stuff that'll make us money, okay? So he finds the Potomac River, Stingray Point, so called because John Smith was stung. He thought it was dead, and he ate the ray for dinner to show him who's boss in that regard. It's kind of humorous. Second voyage, he made it to the head of the bay. Uneven response from the natives. So again, sometimes you got lucky and natives were very welcoming and peaceful, other times not. So just dependent on the tribe, dependent on the disposition of the tribe. Seeing a strange boat like this with strange people is bound to be unsettling for sure, especially if you've never seen this before. It's interesting to note too, the descriptions Native peoples gave of European vessels. Some thought that they were giant birds. They saw the white sails and thought it was a giant seagull. They just had no way to contextualize what it was they were looking at because they'd never seen anything before. It'd be like if a spacecraft were to land in southern Maryland and we're not familiar with it. It's like we've never seen one before. So how do we reference that? How do we sort of make sense of it? Anyway, okay. So what Smith described, oysters lay thick as stones, not like today. Of fish, we were best acquainted with sturgeon, grampus, porpoise, seals, stingrays, brits, mullets, white salmon, which are rockfish, trout, soles, perch of 3 sorts. So a profusion of fish and shellfish, right? More sturgeon than can be devoured by dog or man. So it was a veritable cornucopia of sea life that ripe for the picking. He also saw bears, wolves, cougars, falcons, partridges, waterfowl, and a variety of other animals. Again, trying to tell people that there are things to eat on land as well as sea. Trees of huge diameter and height, so he's thinking about shipbuilding and building of towns. Water was exceedingly clear, unlike today. So just a beautiful virgin area. You have this all up and down the coast in the descriptions. The Europeans describing, like, for example, my old neck of the woods, Cape Cod, when Bradford came over, he described fish in Massachusetts Bay so thick you could walk from Provincetown to Boston without getting wet. Well, it's the same thing on the bay, just an amazing quantity and variety of sea life, okay? So not surprisingly, Europeans settled along the rivers, the creeks, any easy access to water, right? Tobacco cash crop land grants incentivized colonization. We've been over this. Now, we didn't talk really about the pathogens. Death rates in Maryland were terrible initially due to malaria. You have this very humid and sort of aqueous environment, which gives rise to mosquitoes and all manner of insects, which of breeding ground for malaria. Now, interestingly, the offspring of these people were immune. They had developed a natural immunity, and this is true with many of the pathogens that were here. 80% of passengers were indentured servants, and as I mentioned in previous lectures, they had to work 5 to 7 years to pay off the voyage, after which they'd be given a piece of land to work usually, or they could stay on as a paid employee with their noble or their lord's plantation. Mixture of Protestant and Catholics. You don't see that too many times in the history of this country. There was Protestants and Catholics living harmoniously together. And by the end of the 17th century, Maryland population about 30,000 people. So not a lot of people by today's standards. And here you can see these wonderful Chesapeake, this map on the right. Again, they're the various wildlife, the bears, the cougars, the animals you'll find, plenty of water. Just a wonderful place to come settle. Native people look like they're having a good time. They look pretty pleasant and peaceful. There you go. Mm-hmm. So beating a dead horse here, we talked about this quite extensively last week, but just a recap. Again, Maryland, basically agrarian economy centered on tobacco monoculture in a nutshell, as we well know. And labor intensive to produce a lot of tobacco. So, if you were by the end of the 17th century, fewer indentured servants and were replaced by the slave population, as we discussed. Wheat and corn were also very important cash crops in Maryland, but nothing compared to tobacco, at least not initially. As we mentioned last time, wheat and other crops would replace disproportionately tobacco by the end of the 17th century, but not by the beginning or the middle. Maryland's centralized location, profusion of waterways was perfect for exporting goods to other colonies to America. That infrastructure of the water alone, not to mention all of the stuff that would be built around it, like ferry boatways and roads and all that, just that alone was just a natural, perfect situation for commerce, especially, any kind of crop that could be transited via water, like tobacco. As we mentioned last time, Aronico tobacco needed easy water access to avoid damage. It was a little bit more fragile than the other strains of tobacco. And by 1670s, there was 10 million pounds exported from the Chesapeake region alone. So quite a bit of tobacco. And you can see just a recap of a lot of what we talked about last week. The hogsheads of tobaccos up pier side. There's the ship that's going to take it. Here are the English nobles having a grand time. There are the slaves seemingly having a grand time. And an advertisement or parcel of prime slaves. It's sickening, but it's a piece of our history, our collective past. Tobacco plant and population of the Chesapeake colonies from 1610 to 1750. Yeah. So dramatic rise in population, right? So if you use the Chesapeake as one of the anchors of this sort of triangular trade route, Chesapeake and points north, you sort of see a summation of the trade with that Maryland traded with the English and the Dutch. Basically, the short math: manufactured goods for tobacco. We've been over this. Yeah, you would send your tobacco to Europe. You'd be given a credit. Your broker over there would find the things you wanted. It may take a year. Remember, we talked about this. And once he found the things, he would ship them back to you, and your credit would be adjusted accordingly. Alcohol was popular. Some things never change. Navigation acts reduced Dutch competition, as we mentioned last week, with the 3 principal navigation acts, and England trying to consolidate her power over the tobacco trade. And Maryland piggybacked on Virginia trade routes. So Jamestown, as a deep water port, was a principal port, and initially Maryland sort of hopped on that, and before she had developed Baltimore and Annapolis to their fullest potential. So colonial trade, Chesapeake had few trading ships, but traded with Northeast colonies. Like the Dove, for example, was a coastal trader. She would go up and down the coast, bringing things from New England back down to the Chesapeake Bay region. And there were many such vessels, not just, actually the plurality of vessels that came over from England weren't large vessels like Mayflower or Susan Constant or the Ark. They were smaller vessels like Dove, Sparrowhawk, these small, 25 to 40 person vessels. It's just amazing they even got over. Many didn't. So exports of tobacco and corn. By 1680, we had wheat, pork, peas, and hide. So that diversification that everybody was seeking initially, finally, at the end of the century, came to fruition. From the Northeast, Chesapeake bought salt cod, mackerel, lumber, sugar, molasses, salt, rum, and wine. So yeah, booze from from the Northeast, and lumber, of course, large stands of timber up there. Maryland sent corn, wheat, pork, and beef to the West Indies for sugar, molasses, rum, dyes, and other fruits. And of course, that was very perfect symbiotic relationship. And you can see the various dietary the sort of proportions of what types of things were eaten. A lot of cattle, a lot of pig. So a very meat-based diet, which I'm sure is good news to some, bad news to others. Not really an era of vegetarianism at that point. And you also had the various values, trade values by 1768, which is kind of fascinating to look at the various grain, meal, other the various prices of things. Okay, tobacco, of course, leading the way. Looks like 756,000 pounds there. So anyway, okay. So here's a 1721 map of the region, which it's pretty much close to what the bay looks like today. It was one of the earliest fairly accurate maps of the Chesapeake. It's pretty spot on in most regards. Of course, sea level rise has changed a lot of this to some extent, but and of course distortion. This wasn't done via satellite. Satellite images on the left actually, but this is a drawn map to the right, and it's fairly accurate. I mean, given the tools that they had to work with, which a lot of eyeballing and notations and crude measurements of the time, proportional rulers and whatnot to try to figure out the basic widths and lengths of these bodies of water. Pretty good job for the time. All right. So Chesapeake, a haven for ships. Why is that? Well, good old Curator Navalis shipworms love warm, salty environments, like Florida, for example. Anywhere where it's warm and salty, these things thrive, okay? And they're at their peak June through August. So basically, what would happen is ships would come into the bay, maybe, with a severe shipworm problem, and they put into some of the rivers, which were brackish and primarily freshwater, and these things would die off. They wouldn't be interested anymore. It didn't taste good for them. So this is what they would do. They would ships would hang out in the freshwater tributaries to wait out the sort of shipworm season, June through August, and then return to the sea to continue on their way. So yeah, this is before the invention of coppering. Shipworms do not like copper. It leaves a bad taste in their mouth. And of course, nowadays we have bottom paint with cuprous oxide, which is a copper. It's copper basically. That's the active ingredient in the paint that we paint the bottoms of boats today. Still doing the same thing, even though I'm pretty sure shipworms do not like fiberglass. Anyway, it also helps other things not grow, like barnacles. So getting to the bay from other points. A little bit about navigation. Basically, the prevailing trades you can see in this large bubble to the right. You have the southern route, these prevailing trade winds. It takes you right over to the West Indies. This is why square riggers were invented, because you could set that squaresail and these winds would just push you right across. Really little effort. You're going to run into something even without any kind of navigational aid. Of course, as you know, the Gulf Stream goes up the coast. Labrador Current comes down the coast. You can see it up in blue up here and sort of intersects about Newfoundland. So anyway, this is kind of what you did. You went over on the southern route, you went up the coast and returned by the northern route because these were the prevailing winds, right? And it was just easier to do it that way. A lot of these vessels of the time, where they weren't very weatherly, which means they didn't point very well into the wind, like a nice schooner, they're square-rigged, clunky vessels, as we mentioned, and they really needed to take advantage of those prevailing winds. The doldrums, of course, being in the middle where the winds were very vague and uncertain. Okay, so that's basic, and you can see it very graphically down in this lower bubble. The green route over, go up, red route return. So that's kind of what you did to get to the bay. All right. Yeah, 17th century navigation. It's a far cry from GPS, folks. This was the stuff they used: compass, log line, hourglass, traverse board, used to dead reckon. Okay, so I don't know how many of you guys are familiar with the principles of celestial navigation, but latitude wasn't so much a problem. You basically set one of these devices level with the horizon. You sort of rotate the one of these transit boards so you have the sun in your sights, and the angle from that intersection of the horizon and where the sun gives you your latitude. Of course, as we know, longitude wouldn't be solved until John Harrison's first truly accurate maritime chronometer, I think in the 18th century. So that gave you longitude, Greenwich Mean Time versus the time at sea. Deduct the two, and that gives your longitude. Anyway, so this was the tools that they used. Close to shore, this thing on the left was a lead line. It had a little pocket in the bottom, so if you dropped it close to shore and it came up with sand and maybe broken shells, that sort of thing, things you'd see on the coast, you knew you were getting into shallow water, you knew you were getting close to land. The log line was basically a knotted line that was paid out, and you basically use an hourglass. How many knots passed through your hand in a specified amount of time gave you how many knots, so-called, you were traveling. Okay, that's where that came from. So anyway, these are very crude but somewhat effective methods of navigating during this time. As I mentioned, the prevailing trade winds, you could find your latitude, so you wouldn't go too far south, too far north. Find the latitude that you wanted. You could pretty much stay on course and land where you wanted to. And the cross-staff, backstaff, Davis quadrant could ascertain latitude by 10 to 15 nautical miles. So that's pretty good. It's pretty good. I mean, you're definitely going to hit something using that. You might not hit a small atoll, but you're definitely going to find Cuba or South America. So this is just we mentioned this, the Hampton Roads, Deepwater Port, and mouth of the James River. Jamestown was in an international port, strategic importance that controls the mouth of the bay. We've been over and over this with the wars, and we'll talk about this next week with the Civil War, why this was so important too. Battle of Hampton Roads between the Monitor and the Merrimack. Anywho, okay. So once you got to the bay, once you're at the mouth, you typically pick up a pilot. A pilot was somebody who was familiar with the ins and the outs of the bay, knew the shoal areas, knew what to look for, knew what to avoid. So yeah, some of the captains had a good working knowledge of the bay. Those were sought after for voyages to the bay, but most times you'd pick up somebody else at the bay, and they would come aboard your ship and help you get where you're going, okay? The major western shore rivers are navigable for many miles, in some cases to the fall line, as I mentioned. So not surprisingly, roads sprung up to connect river commerce to inland areas. So yeah, this vast infrastructure that was to spring up around this pre-railroad, spring up around the bay, connecting all of these tiny waterways, creeks, areas. It was extensive, and it was amazing, and it was well used. Okay, I mean, really, people maximized on it to get the stuff to where it was going. So during the 18th century, settlement across the fall line, large Piedmont tracts were used for growing wheat, corn, in addition to tobacco. So as I mentioned, the towns emerged at the juncture between the Piedmont Plain and the Tidewater regions, such as Upper Marlboro and the Patuxent, Baltimore and the Patapsco, Georgetown and Alexandria and the Potomac, and Richmond on the James. So these major towns, right, started off as small little villages with usually a mill, a grist mill, and a few buildings, a few warehouses for storing tobacco, turned into these huge towns based on their location on the fall line, right, to use that water power. It was invaluable. So it's free power, basically. All right. So fall line towns as commercial epicenters. Yeah, warehouses are built in fall line towns and Western Shore rivers. Around these, I'm just recapping what I just said. Around these commercial centers grew towns. Each town serviced the hinterlands, the lands beyond the Piedmont. International exchanges, most important urban centers during the 1700s. Some important towns were not on fall lines. The biggest of the fall line towns was Baltimore. So, of course, not surprising that would become a major port, a major city, okay? All right, so Port of Baltimore, founded in 1706 as a port of entry for the tobacco trade between Maryland and England. Yeah, this is where the trade would leave and come in. If you had those finished goods that you wanted from England, rugs, tapestries, chairs, whatnot, would come into Baltimore and be transited to you eventually, or you could come up to Baltimore via packet and collect your cargo, okay? Deepwater Port, Fells Point being the deepest. Not surprisingly, Fells Point is a huge maritime epicenter. Shipbuilding was popular by the late 17th century, and this is where, of course, the famed Baltimore Clippers evolved from this point. This is one up in the upper right-hand corner. Very fast, shallow draft, heavily canvassed, heavily sparred, Great for smuggling, great for blockade running, and great for swift transit. I mean, time was money, just as it is then as it is now. So getting your cargo quickly to where it was going was important, right? If you had a slow boat, take forever, and you'd have to feed a crew, and you'd have to pay a crew a daily wage. So quicker meant increased profits for the owner and less, less sort of expense as well for having to pay crew and wages and whatnot. Fort McHenry was built to protect the port between 1798 and 1800, and there it is in the upper left, this sort of pentagonal arrangement, and earthworks and various roads prominent on the point there, okay? So Annapolis became the seat of the government after St. Mary's in 1694, so end of the 17th century. It was a port of navigable water right in the bay, had shipyards, rope walks, same as Baltimore, sailmakers and chandleries, definitely a maritime port. Center of commerce until replaced by Baltimore, and it was also home of the U.S. Naval Academy, which was built in 1845. Other important non-fall line towns include Norfolk, Williamsburg, and Chestertown. So, it just, there was a mixture of towns that towns grow for various reasons. But the fall line towns are really the takeaway for tonight's talk is if you remember anything, remember how important those two junctions between the coastal plain and the Piedmont Plain were. So roads connecting river towns by and beyond, mentioned this. These roads connected to these waterways, faraway communities. Tobacco could not be transferred overland, need to be near water, as we mentioned. More durable goods could be further inland, okay? So during that diversification process, other things could be made much farther inland and transited via river to the bay eventually. Didn't need to have a very delicate treatment like the delicate tobacco, the Oronoco strain, okay? So how do you get across these little rivers? Say you want to go, you don't want to go all the way down the river, you want to go directly north. Well, this is where ferries popped up. So small creeks and rivers were crossed using ferries. Initially, some were just a simple pair of dugout canoes with a few planks over them. They tied a line from one shore to the other with a block and tackle, and you basically, and a lead line, you pull yourself across or pull yourself across. There were larger ferries, of course. These were vessels for crossing the bay. It's kind of a shame that we don't have more ferries across the bay at this point. I mean, going all the way up to the Bay Bridge is kind of a pain. It'd be really nice to have a ferry service between, say, the Solomons and the Eastern Shore, but that's a whole nother thing. In Maryland, the ferry system would become standardized and controlled by the government. Of course, as things became more codified and profits were to be had, these sort of ad hoc ferry systems needed to be systematized and run to a schedule so you could count on it. If you got there at 9 p.m. with whatever you were selling, the ferry would be waiting for you and you could take it across, type of thing. All right. So from 1639, packet sloop and schooners. This was the primary type of vessel that was used. These schooners were very weatherly, swift boats, as like we described the Baltimore Clipper. They were later, but these early schooners were just the thing to use for getting up and down the bay. They would work in any wind, very handy. More importantly, you only needed a couple of people to crew a schooner with a self-tending jib, and you had a main and a foresail. Very, very, very economical boats to transit a large amount of stuff with just a few crew. So bay ferries were usually semi-deck sloops or schooners. Fees and schedules at this point were published. Ferries ran from Annapolis to Kent Island, Rock Hall Ferry 25 miles up the bay from Annapolis. So the Ferriage Act of 1702, government stepped in and fixed rate schedules and wages for ferrymen. Now there's a lot of fuss about this. The ferrymen were like, well, who are you to say what I can charge? This guy that crosses a small creek doesn't have as much expense as me. I'm crossing, a Rappahannock River or the Potomac. It's much, much larger. So there's a lot of debate about that, debate and acrimony over the Ferriage Act of 1702. But by 1729, ferries were running up and down the bay to all points. So they sorted it out. They worked it out so that it was equitable, and everybody was happy for a time anyway. Okay. So steam ferries and packets. The bay's first steamer was not surprisingly named the Chesapeake. It ran from Baltimore to Annapolis in 1813. So this is the rise of steam power, which is even more, I don't know if it's certainly more profitable when you don't have to depend on the wind. You can simply go from point A to point B. You don't have to tack. You don't have to worry about the winds dying. Made things much more reliable in terms of schedules, right? Because steamers ran on time, and it was a predictable quantity. I mean, the bay was a protected environment. There weren't storms to contend with, like say on the North Atlantic. If any of you are familiar with what happened to the steamer, the Portland, which is called New England's Titanic, that's a whole other horrible story. But anyway, on the bay, these were able to run on very tight schedules, and they could pack a lot of people, so they made a lot of money to offset the expense of crew and coal and whatnot, or wood. So at this point, 20 companies serviced the bay. The last steamer line ran from Baltimore to Norfolk, and all steamers ended in 1962. Bay Bridge was built in the 70s, so there you kind of connected the eastern shore to the western shore. And you can see some of these Old Bay Line, these wonderful promotional flyers and handouts that cropped up around these. And this was a whole other culture that you have to understand. I mean, many of these steamers were very luxurious in their appointments and their interior cabins and staterooms. And it was just a wonderful thing to say, pick up. I mean, there were night ferries. There were all kinds of night steamers that you could take and book a stateroom and just take a nap or sleep. And you wake up and you'd be in Solomons or points further south. The meals were good. There was music. There was alcohol. So these were wonderful things in a very unique context. Also, what's important about steamers is there were cross sections of people that, by virtue of the confined space, were forced to interact with one another when they probably wouldn't ordinarily. They travel in very different social circles. So there was this sort of rise of steamboat culture that was a lot of different people commingling and learning about different ways of other people's lives. So it's a very unique context, and people really enjoyed it. It was a delightful way. When you think about the alternative before pre-railroad, of bumpy roads and dusty, and sometimes a tree would fall across a road or flood. This was the cat's meow. Nice and calm on this boat with beautiful appointments and wonderful food. Just the way to go. I mean, you could spend a whole night just talking about the steamers and their design and their construction and this culture I'm speaking about. Here's a prime example of one of the most durable lines, the Weems line. Of course, there's many Weems in Calvert County that survive to this day. Had its origins as far back as 1819, was incorporated in 1827. Had a fleet of steamers, and you can see there they are: Surprise Eagle, Patuxent, Mary Washington, Planter, between Baltimore, Patuxent, Rappahannock, River Points, including Solomons and Fredericksburg. So Weems line, yep, put in right in the Solomons. This is the arrival of the steamer was something that was greatly anticipated. People were very excited to see the steamer come, because this meant many people would go on shot. Like for example, in Solomons, many people would go. It was an event just before any kind of digital entertainment. People would take the steamer up to Baltimore, go on a shopping trip. Say a mother and daughter would go on a shopping trip, buy the daughter a new dress. The mother would get some things, pick up a few finer items she couldn't get in Southern Maryland, and come back. And it was a kind of a wonderful, wonderful thing. So the Weems line was incredibly durable, survived as an independent entity for 88 years before it merged with other lines that continued to the early 1920s. So they ran their business really well. They ran their steamers very well. And that's why they lasted so long. Average boats were between 120 and 190 feet. So they're good size, and depart at Baltimore 4 p.m., stop at half a dozen or more wharves, and not reach your final port till 24 hours later. But you didn't mind, as I mentioned, it was a very enjoyable way to spend a voyage. And you could stand up on the deck and look at and admire the scenery and catch a sea breeze, sit in a chair and drink lemonade. I mean, it was just a wonderful, wonderful experience. So we talked a little bit about 17th century navigation, this system of pilots who are familiar with the shoals and the harbors and the creeks and whatnot. Well, by 19th century, it was a little bit more standardized in terms of navigation beacons or lighthouses, okay? There were 24 lighthouses in the Maryland portion of the bay, And these are a mixture of, screw pile cottage styles like Drum Point Lighthouse, for example, casement and other types. And they ranged. I mean, some were out to sea, others were on land. Drum Point, as you know, was off Drum Point here in Solomons before being moved to the Calvert Marine Museum, and she was isolated by water that eventually silted in. Anyway, these were your waypoints heading up the bay, looking for these various lights, and they're coded beacons, importantly. So you knew that if it was a white flash followed by two red, followed by a white, it would be, Sandy Point Shoal or Thomas Point or whatever the coding was. And this is in heavy fog. This is a very welcome sight, right? Because even though the bay is protected and fairly tame compared to, say, the North Atlantic, still, if you're lost, you're lost. And these beacons were very helpful in making your way. Notice that Cove Point, our own Cove Point Lighthouse, which is right up here, sort of marks the narrowest pinch point in the bay heading north. Okay, so very important to have a light there. And on many of the islands and shoal areas, there was also a light as well. You can see the profusion of lights up here around Annapolis. Okay, all right. So just a little nod to the screw pile. This is basically an English invention, like so many things. Originally, you can see in this lower right hand, it was first screw pile, I think, was erected on the Thames River. And it was done, you can see the screw down here, and there's the pile. And it was done via a capstan. So basically a human-operated method of driving this thing into the soil. These guys worked this like a crank and screwed this thing into the soil, and hence the term screw pile. It's screwed into the sandy bottom of a river or a bay, and thus anchoring it in such a way. Now, the Drum Point Lighthouse, this is all cast iron and steel. So this was a total offshoot of the Industrial Revolution, and we've often speculated on how exactly this was done. It was probably there was probably some fashion of jig that was erected on barges to get the spacing exactly right, because everything fits together perfectly, right? So how do you do that? Well, I really don't have a completely satisfactory answer, but I suspect it was done, of course, by steam engine. At this time, this hand windlass idea was quickly abandoned because it was too labor intensive and not powerful enough. So these were done by steam engine and screwed into the sand that way, and then the rest was erected. And then upon that, a cottage was built, cottage style, which had 2 or 3 floors plus, the lantern room. So anyway, very comfortable lighthouse. Those of you that have been to Drum Point will attest to this. Very comfortable place to live. I wouldn't mind living in a place like Drum Point Lighthouse. It's got a heck of a view and feels comfortable enough to me if you like octagonal shaped buildings. So, all right. So navigation and weather today. So we still have our lighthouses. Many are deactivated. Our own Cove Point does have a beacon in it, a halogen bulb maintained by the Coast Guard. Okay, so it's still an aid to navigation, but we have these Chesapeake Bay, NOAA put these bay interpreted buoy systems. These buoys have a wonderful, and they collect meteorological, oceanographic, water quality data, and relay this via Wi-Fi to a variety of users. So you can call this line here and get up-to-date information on each of these buoys' locations. So if you want to know what the weather is or tides or whatever in various points of the bay, you just call in and you can do it. There's an app for your cell phone, so your Android or iPhone. So yeah, it's a very efficient and user-friendly way to navigate the bay these days and get information, up-to-date information, right? No lag time at all. We do have a display of these, I believe in the estuarine biology portion of the museum. There's one of these buoys on display there, which explains a little bit more about it. Okay. Yeah, so the climate, shallowness of the bay and coastal areas contribute to steep, choppy seas. Anybody who's sailed or even powerboated on the bay knows this, that the see sort of stand up. They're not the big rolling swells of the ocean, but they're short and choppy, and they can be quite pronounced and quite difficult at times. There's ice in the winter. Warmth of water, increased heat and humidity of the region. Yeah, it gives rise to unpredictable squalls, and also the rise of the shellfish industry, which we'll discuss now. That's a skipjack up here. Looks like she's reefed down under a blow, and there's like a squall off to the left. It's a wonderful painting. Of course, the Bay Bridge with a Coast Guard icebreaker carving a channel through in the winter. All right. Oops, sorry. So salinity, a little bit about the salinity of the bay and what environment certain species like best, and what depth of water certain things like best. So you can see the salinity parts per thousand here in this very graphic representation. Naturally getting more salty as you head towards the mouth, Norfolk, less so as you head north with more freshwater influx. Okay, so saltier as you move south, less so as you move north. It's pretty pretty simple. And here you can see basically the different species and the different depths of water, types of things, deep water channel, shallow open water, migratory fish spawning in nursery areas, striped bass, shad, perch, so forth, so on. Of course, the worms, number one, deep channel. All right. Okay, so oysters. Yeah, 16. You mentioned. Remember, we talked about John Smith, and he said they were stacked thick in the bay. So 1607, Perry noted Indians roasting oysters. So this made the connection that you could eat them. Chesapeake oysters were huge and delicious. Yeah, we have one, I think, in Lower Oyster House. It's about 13 inches in length. That's huge. My God, it's over a foot. Can you imagine? That could feed us, a small family. So warm bay water supplied with organic sediment from Piedmont regions nourished indigenous oysters. Perfect breeding ground for oysters. Okay, and of course, up in New England, my old stomping ground, Cape Cod, they really pride themselves in their oysters. But guess what? Those oysters were imported from the Chesapeake Bay to seed those northern beds. Wellfleet oyster, those were seeded from the Chesapeake Bay. So a little bit of a shallow claim for New England. Yeah, it's strange you notice Virginia oysters 13 inches long, and we have a specimen like that. So the shells from the oysters were used, crushed up, to pave roads or as fill, right? It was another resource, might as well use it. It's very hard. We actually have an oyster shell crushing machine in that large shed. If you're familiar with Lower Oyster House, there's a large shed that's near the water, and there's a oyster shell crushing machine in there that was used to make those crushed oyster fill or paving material. And look at this, moving from the 17th century, looks like the 1600s, all the way to year 2000, Maryland oyster harvest in millions of bushels. You can see there's a peak right here and then slow decline, right? So what accounts for that? Well, again, this is this old battle between regulation and harvesting, or over harvesting. Fishermen want to make money. The more they harvest, the more they make. The government, as Department of Natural Resources, et cetera, the fisheries, NOAA, et cetera, Shell and Game Committee. I mean, they all have a hand in trying to make this a sustainable industry so it's there for future generations. And it's a tough row to hoe. I mean, regulations, again, I could speak to New England. It's very heavily regulated up there, and such that fishermen are forced to go out on the days that the fisheries say is okay, even though there might be a gale blowing or a nor'easter, they have to go out, and they lose 3 boats a year, just gone, swallowed up by the ocean, just gone. It's dangerous. It was dangerous. It is dangerous. Bay, not as much because it's protected, but there is, because it is so protected, there is the danger of over harvesting, which, yeah. So I love this graphic up on the left. H.W. Hitchcock's Baltimore oysters are always reliable, and there it is biting this guy in the pants. We have many such graphic ads for oysters and oyster packing and oyster cans in our collection if you're interested. All right. Yeah, so oyster beds today, as I just mentioned, oyster harvests are about a fraction of what they once were. Really, what did it was dredging. Okay, oyster tonging, which as you can see, this is a tong in the lower left, and there's a tonger in this crab scrape here. This was a very sustainable way of oyster harvesting because it was labor intensive. It took time. Didn't really deplete the beds. Now, when you get into the dredging, the unregulated dredging by larger vessels, that really just destroyed the beds. I mean, scraped them all up. It was wonderful for the fishermen because you got a huge catch in a very short amount of time, but it was not good for the fishery. Okay, so you can see it's kind of the short math of it. Dredging really spelled the decline of the oyster fishery in the Chesapeake Bay. So you can see on this right-hand graphic public shellfish areas and sanctuaries. These sanctuaries are meant to protect oysters so they can perpetuate their species in perpetuity. Oysters from these beds are taken to seed the other beds that are public access. So it's an effort to, and it's imperfect at best, it's an effort to control and regulate and sustain a very wonderful resource, okay? And it works imperfectly, okay? All right. So crabs, we think of crabs that, have always really been here, but it's not. It's a 20th century invention or phenomenon rather that developed the Maryland, Chesapeake developed their blue crab fisheries around, middle of the close of the World War II, 1945. Yeah, you can take a look here. 1873, the start of it. Soft blue shell crabs were shipped from Crisfield, Maryland to Philadelphia. People got a taste for them such that it facilitated the industry. The hard blue shell or blue crab fishery originated in 1878 with an opening cannery in Virginia, and by demand it was widespread. So that fueled the harvesting of crabs. Yeah, as I mentioned, so by the 50s, South Atlantic, Gulf of Mexico regions began producing, a lot of crab impacting our market. So sure, I mean, whoever has the cheaper price is going to get the business, right? So yeah, so I mean, we don't have time to go into this. It's just kind of a broad strokes. Yeah, I've mentioned this, covered this pretty thoroughly. Been practiced since colonial times, and shad and herring have been historical staple crops. And yeah, you can see again the decline from 1880 to 1981 of these fisheries. So watermen are still a viable component and feature of the bay. They still make a modest living and should be encouraged, and really a fixture on the bay. I mean, huge business around crabs and oysters still on the bay, even though the stocks have been depleted. This is the middle pane on the right. This is an dredge, an oyster dredge, usually pulled from a skipjack or bug eyes or various vessels, and this is really what depleted the beds. So I think that's about it. Yeah, some conclusions. So geologic formation of the bay made it an ideal place for water travel. Junction, the Piedmont Plain coastal chain gave rise to many fall line towns, which I've beaten you over the head with. Native peoples practiced unparalleled land and water stewardship for over 7,000 years. If we could only return to some of that, it'd be just wonderful for the bay. So bay commerce was facilitated by many tributaries and creeks that fed into the bay. Sailing packet steamers, ferries maximized on the water assets of the bay. And fisheries evolved and unfortunately depleted much of the bay's shellfish and fish. That's basically it in a nutshell. Let me stop share. What time is it? Oh, look at that, 6 o'clock. It's always good if you can keep it to an hour. Let's see, what do we have here? We have some chat questions. Prior to independence from England, who was making enforcing the laws? Ferries Act of 1702. Local governments were, yeah. That's right. It wasn't a federal thing. North Carolina makes a big deal about their pirates. Doesn't seem these rays had many. Why? Well, there were pirates on the Chesapeake Bay. Yeah, I didn't really get into that because with every law, there's an attempt to break it, or every oppressive piece of legislation, there's an attempt to circumnavigate it or get around it. The oyster wars, for example. I believe we talked about those. The attempt to regulate the oyster trade, and fishermen saw that this is their livelihood, and who was Maryland, the Maryland Navy? Who were they to say when we can and cannot fish. So cause and effect. Yeah. Are there other questions about the watery highways? Nothing? Okay. All right. Well, thank you all for tuning in. I hope you enjoyed tonight's talk. And I think next Maryland Age of Sail is on the Civil War. So that'll be a fun one. That is a fun one. You'll enjoy that. Loaded with boats and battles and all kinds of crazy stuff. Men dressing up as women to try to get around Union blockades. So we'll have some fun with that one. And don't forget, Lusitania, the U-20, U-20 torpedoes Lusitania next Monday. Talk about Woodrow Wilson's response, Maryland's view of this event, and lots of other stuff too. So stay tuned.
Thanks so much, Mark. Thank you all for tuning in this evening, and we'll have this up on our website probably sometime early next week. And then join us on Monday at 5 p.m. for the Lusitania special talk. And then remember that this series continues again in 2 weeks at 5 p.m. on Thursday. That would be 22nd. Is that correct? I think
that sounds right.
Whatever 6 plus 14. I was told there would be no math. Take care and enjoy your evening. And thanks for tuning in. We appreciate it.
Thank you all.
Again. Thank you.
You bet. Good night.